Since this court has already indicated in Heller that Congress could prohibit felons or mentally ill individuals from possessing guns without violating the Second Amendment, doesn't it make sense that restricting possession by juveniles is also constitutional? No, Your Honor, it does not make sense that restricting possession by juveniles is also constitutional. As seen in the writings for the Second Amendment, we know that the founders who wrote the parts of the Second Amendment believe that no law should be made that takes away their rights under the Second Amendment unless someone has committed crimes or unless they show a real threat to other individuals. We see that applies to felons because they've possibly done something, committed a crime that is like too much. And mentally ill individuals are not trustworthy. We don't know if they will commit a crime, maybe not knowing or not being able to control themselves. And it's not fair to apply that to juveniles because juveniles have not necessarily shown that they're irresponsible in every situation. Specifically in this situation, we have seen that Johnson showed signs of responsibility. How should we account for Congress's findings about youth gun violence when you analyze the Second Amendment issue in this case? Do they make a difference? If so, how? The findings of Congress about youth gun violence do not necessarily make a difference in this case because using youth gun violence does not necessarily apply under the Safe Schools Act because the Safe Schools Act generally applies for people under the age of 21, which includes people who are 18 to 21, who are actually adults, and applying those statistics about youth gun violence doesn't necessarily apply. What legal standard should be used to decide the Second Amendment issue in this case? Why should we use that standard? I don't think we should use strict or intermediate scrutiny for this case, mostly because of the fact that the Safe Schools Act is way too broad. It's overbroad. There's a lot of things that necessarily don't relate in terms of how the possession of minors for certain activities where it doesn't apply, like in the house or for hunting, or for applying the Safe Schools Act for young adults between 18 and 21, because at this point they're at a good age of majority and should be able to possess a firearm or possibly even be in the military, which probably practically is prohibited under the Safe Schools Act. And generally, this Safe Schools Act has problems with where it kind of creates an ex post facto prohibition. Since Mr. Johnson was not arrested for possession of a gun in his home, should we even be considering what effect the Safe Schools Act might have on self-defense in the home? Yes, Your Honor, we should consider the effects Safe Schools Act might have on self-defense in the home, because we know that we've established that the Safe Schools Act is way too broad. Ignoring the facts of self-defense in the home would practically be ignoring that the Safe Schools Act is way too broad. The impact of the Safe Schools Act, we've seen that it's practically supposed to apply to schools, but because it applies so broadly in so many different places, we have to consider that in this case. No matter if Mr. Johnson was arrested in his home under the possession of a gun or not. Do you agree that reducing youth gun violence is a compelling government issue or goal? If so, do you agree that prohibiting the possession of guns by minors has a substantial relationship to that goal? Yes, Your Honor, I do agree that reducing youth gun violence is a compelling government interest or goal. And I also do agree that prohibiting the possession of guns by minors has a substantial relationship to the goal. Obviously, prohibiting The use of guns by minors could really help reduce the stats that we found on youth gun violence. But I do think it is an overshoot and an overreach with how much the government has an interest in youth gun violence. I think that they should be more specific when it comes to it, and because they're trying to be so broad that it takes the conversation off of youth gun violence and puts it back on like constitutional provisions. Is the Second Amendment analysis in this case affected by the fact that Congress did not create a buyback program for previously purchased guns, like the one that Mr. Johnson was using at the time he was arrested? If so, how? The Second Amendment analysis is affected by the fact that Congress did not create a buyback program for previously purchased guns, because the fact that Johnson was criminalized for the possession of guns that were like legally purchased before the passage of the act, it practically creates an ex post facto prohibition, which in turn will prove that the Safe Schools Act does fail the substantial relationship test.